The massive lecture hall of the Galactic Military Academy buzzed with the sound of 300 students settling into their seats. Some floated, others crawled, and a few rolled into position, each species finding their own comfortable way to prepare for the day's lesson. The chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, with adaptive seating that could accommodate everything from gas-based life forms to crystalline entities. At the front of the hall, Professor Gray materialized from his energy state into his preferred teaching form, a tall, silvery figure with multiple limbs that moved like flowing mercury. His voice, calm and clear, carried through the room's perfect acoustics. "Today's lecture," he began, "will cover Section 7 of Galactic Military Law, Prohibited Species in Warfare." The professor's form shimmered as he activated the hall's main display, projecting a list that stretched from floor to ceiling. The students immediately began recording the information, their various data capture methods creating a symphony of soft clicks, hums, and whispers. Some absorbed the data directly through their skin, while others used more traditional methods like neural interfaces or simple notepads. "As you can see," Professor Gray continued, "this list includes the most dangerous entities known to our civilization. The World Eaters of Sector 9, the Void Walkers, the Reality Benders of the Quantum Realm." He paused for effect. "And humans." A wave of confusion rippled through the audience. Near the front, a blue-skinned student with crystalline hair raised an appendage. The professor nodded, acknowledging the question. "Professor." The student spoke, their translator converting their musical language into standard galactic common. "There must be some mistake. Humans are a Class 3 civilization. They've barely mastered basic space travel. How can they be on the same list as the World Eaters?" Professor Gray's form shifted, displaying what humans would recognize as a smile. "An excellent question, Blue. Would it surprise you to know that humans aren't on this list because they're dangerous? They're on it because they're too effective." More appendages rose into the air, but the professor held up 3 of his limbs for silence. "Perhaps I should show you. Computer, access historical file 7A, the 7-Day War." The lights dimmed, and a holographic display filled the center of the hall. It showed a star map of a distant sector, with 2 opposing forces represented in different colors. One was a massive red cloud spreading across hundreds of systems. The other was a much smaller blue network of worlds. "This recording," the professor explained, "shows the only time humans were allowed to participate in a galactic-scale conflict. The red mass you see is the Swarm, a hive-mind species that threatened to consume half the galaxy. The blue systems represent the Coalition forces, our combined galactic defense fleet." Blue raised their appendage again. "But Professor, I studied this war. It lasted only 7 days. The records say the Coalition used a secret weapon to win." Professor Gray's form rippled with what might have been amusement. "We did use a secret weapon, Blue. We used humans." A low murmur of disbelief spread through the hall. A student from the gaseous species in the upper tiers released a burst of confused pheromones. "But humans are primitive," called out another student, their photosynthetic skin flashing with emotion. "Their ships are made of basic metals. They still use chemical propulsion." "Exactly," Professor Gray said, his form growing more solid with enthusiasm. "When we found them, humans had just achieved basic spaceflight. Their technology was centuries behind the galactic standard. Their ships were fragile, their weapons primitive, and their understanding of the universe was limited." He manipulated the display, zooming in on a small blue dot. "This was their first contact point. We discovered them purely by accident while retreating from the Swarm. Standard procedure called for avoiding pre-FTL civilizations, but we were desperate. The Swarm had destroyed our main fleets. Our best weapons had failed. We needed something the Swarm wouldn't expect." The professor's form shifted to a deep blue color, matching the historical footage. "What we didn't understand then, what we couldn't understand, was that humans don't think like the rest of us. They don't follow the normal rules of warfare. He played a short clip showing a human ship, crewed by galactic standards, facing off against a portion of the swarm. The students watched in fascination as the tiny vessel did something completely unexpected. It flew directly into the heart of the enemy formation. "This was our first clue," Professor Gray said, freezing the image. "No rational species would attempt such a suicidal maneuver. But humans have a different definition of rational." Blue's crystalline hair sparkled with interest. "Did they survive?" "Not only did they survive," the professor replied, "they won that engagement. This single human ship destroyed 17 swarm vessels. How they did it is why we're having this lecture today." He moved to the center of the room, his form growing larger. "You see, students, every spacefaring race develops according to certain patterns. We all discover the same basic principles of physics, engineering, and warfare. We build upon the work of those who came before us. We follow the rules." His form shifted, displaying scenes from human history. But humans never got that message. They developed in isolation, facing challenges that would have destroyed most species. Instead of dying, they adapted. Instead of following rules, they made their own. When faced with superior forces, they didn't surrender. They got creative. The professor's form returned to normal size. "That's why this lecture is so important. You're not here to learn about some unstoppable warrior race. You're here to understand why giving humans access to advanced technology is considered a serious military crime." He looked around the room, making eye contact with various students. "Because the last time we did that, they took our standard-issue mining equipment and turned it into something that could crack planets. They'd modified our medical nanites into weapon systems we still don't fully understand. They looked at our peaceful terraforming technology and saw potential for mass destruction that had never occurred to us in 10,000 years of development." The hall was silent now, every student focused intently on the professor. "But sir," Blue spoke up again, her voice quieter now, "if they're so effective, why not use them? Surely having powerful allies is good." Professor Gray's form softened, becoming almost transparent. "Because, young one, using humans as weapons would be both unethical and dangerous. Not because they're evil, quite the opposite. Humans are capable of great compassion, remarkable kindness, and unfailing loyalty. But when they fight," he paused, his form solidifying again. "When they fight, they don't stop until either they're dead or their enemy is completely destroyed. There is no middle ground, no acceptable losses, no strategic withdrawal." He brought up another display, showing statistics from the 7-Day War. In just 7 days, humans changed the face of galactic warfare forever. And that's why they're on this list. Not to protect us from them, but to protect them, and the galaxy, from being used as living weapons ever again. The professor moved back to his podium, his form settling into its standard teaching configuration. "And now, if you're ready, I'll show you exactly what happened during those 7 days. I warn you, some of this footage is disturbing. It will change how you think about warfare, about technology, and about what makes a species truly dangerous." The lights dimmed further, and the main display came to life again. The students leaned forward, ready to learn the truth about why humans were placed on the same list as the most dangerous forces in the galaxy. "Remember," Professor Gray said softly, "sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that's most powerful. It's the one that can turn anything into a weapon. And humans can turn anything into a weapon." The first images of the 7-Day War began to play, and 300 students from across the galaxy watched in growing amazement as they learned the real reason humans were banned from galactic warfare. The lecture hall's lighting shifted to a deep blue as Professor Gray activated the historical archives. The three-dimensional display showed a massive fleet of coalition ships retreating from an even larger swarm of red dots that seemed to devour everything in their path. "This," Professor Gray said, his silvery form glowing softly in the darkness, "was the state of the war before humans entered the picture. Our forces had been fighting for 3 years, and we were losing badly. Blue, the curious student from the front row, watched intently as the recording showed coalition ships disappearing one by one. Their crystalline hair dimmed with sadness. How many were lost? In just those 3 years, we lost 60% of our combined fleet, the professor replied. The swarm adapted to every weapon we created. They evolved faster than we could develop countermeasures. Our scientists estimated total defeat within 2 months. He waved a limb, and the display changed to show a small blue and green planet. Then we found Earth. Our scout ships detected their primitive radio signals and early space experiments. Standard protocol said we should avoid contact with such a young civilization, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The recording shifted to show the first contact meeting. Human representatives sat across from various alien species in what appeared to be a hastily converted aircraft hangar. The humans looked remarkably calm for a species meeting aliens for the first time. What you're seeing is perhaps the fastest first contact integration in galactic history, Professor Gray continued. We didn't have time for the usual century of gradual introduction. We needed soldiers, and we needed them immediately. A student from the upper tiers, whose body was made entirely of flowing liquid, rippled with curiosity. But Professor, how could they help? Their technology was primitive. Professor Gray's form sparkled with what might have been amusement. Watch. The display showed human scientists examining alien technology. Their reactions were not what the students expected. Instead of awe or reverence, the humans showed intense focus and something else. Notice their expressions, the professor said. Our analysts missed it at the time, but these humans weren't just learning about our technology. They were already thinking about how to modify it. The recording advanced to show human engineers taking apart coalition equipment. They worked with incredible speed, their hands moving with surprising confidence as they reconstructed alien devices in new ways. Within 48 hours of receiving our technology, Professor Gray explained, humans had already improved the efficiency of our basic energy weapons by 30%. They didn't fully understand the scientific principles involved, but that didn't stop them. They just tried things until they worked. Blue raised their appendage again. But surely that's dangerous, testing unknown technology without understanding it. Extremely dangerous, the professor agreed. We lost 3 testing facilities to explosions in the first week, but the humans just kept going. They called it rapid prototyping and seemed to view the explosions as valuable data points. The display shifted to show human ships being upgraded with coalition technology. The vessels looked strange. A mix of primitive human construction and advanced alien modifications. This is where things get interesting, Professor Gray said. We gave them our standard weapons and defensive systems, basic equipment that we considered obsolete against the swarm. The humans took one look at these obsolete weapons and saw possibilities we had never imagined. The recording showed a human ship approaching a swarm vessel. Instead of engaging in standard combat maneuvers, the human ship did something completely unexpected. It launched what appeared to be mining equipment. That, the professor pointed, was a standard asteroid mining laser, useful for cutting up space rocks, but completely useless as a weapon, or so we thought. The humans modified it to emit a focused pulse instead of a continuous beam. When the pulse hit the swarm ship's shell, the students watched in amazement as the swarm vessel literally shattered into pieces. They weaponized the resonance frequency. A student from a silicon-based species called out, their crystal body vibrating with excitement. Exactly, Professor Gray confirmed. A mining tool, designed to carefully cut through rock, became one of the most effective anti-swarm weapons we had ever seen. And that was just the beginning. The display showed more human innovations, cargo tractor beams reconfigured to tear apart enemy ships, communication arrays modified to disrupt the swarm's hive-mind connection, medical nanites reprogrammed to target swarm biology. The humans had a saying, the professor continued, necessity is the mother of invention. When we told them about the swarm threatening their world, They didn't react with fear. They got angry, and then they got creative. Blue's crystalline hair pulsed with confusion. But Professor, weren't they afraid? The swarm had defeated the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. Professor Gray's form shifted to display what humans would recognize as a serious expression. That's the thing about humans, Blue. They're always afraid. But fear doesn't paralyze them. It motivates them. The more desperate the situation, the more creative they become. The professor moved to the center of the room, his form expanding to better interact with the display. In just 7 days, humans completely changed how we thought about warfare. They didn't follow any of the standard military doctrines. They didn't even try to understand the proper way to use our technology. They just looked at what they had and asked one simple question: how can we use this to win? The display showed the turning point of the war, a massive battle where human ships darted between swarm vessels, using modified civilian equipment in ways that made several students emit distress signals. Look closely, Professor Gray instructed. Those aren't military vessels. Those are converted cargo ships. The humans took our standard trade fleet equipment and turned each ship into what they called a glass cannon. Minimal defense, but enough modified mining equipment to destroy dozens of swarm ships. A student near the back raised a sensory appendage. But that's suicide. The casualty rates must have been enormous. Actually, the professor replied, human casualty rates were surprisingly low. They had something they called video games that helped them master impossible maneuvers in simulated environments. By the time they faced real combat, their pilots could navigate battlefield chaos like they were born to it. The recording continued, showing more and more human innovations. Each one seemed more improbable than the last, yet they all worked. And this, Professor Gray said, his form dimming slightly, is why humans are now banned from galactic warfare. Not because they're unstoppable killing machines, but because they're too good at turning anything into a weapon. Give a human a healing device, they'll find a way to use it for combat. Give them terraforming technology, they'll figure out how to unterraform a planet. The professor moved back to his podium, the display showing the final statistics of the 7-day war. The humans saved us all. They defeated an enemy that had nearly destroyed our civilization. And then they did something even more remarkable. Blue leaned forward. What did they do? They went home. Professor Gray said simply. They gave back most of our technology, kept only what they had earned through treaty, and returned to their planet. They said they had no interest in conquering the galaxy. They just wanted to make sure their world was safe. The lights in the lecture hall gradually returned to normal levels. And that, students, is why humans are on the prohibited species list. Not because they're a threat, but because they're too good at warfare. The ban protects them as much as it protects us. It ensures that no one can ever use humans as weapons again. The professor's form solidified into its teaching configuration. Now, shall we examine exactly how they modified our medical nanites to shut down swarm neural pathways? I warn you, this next part might make some of you question everything you know about biological warfare. The students settled in, their various data recording methods ready for what promised to be an even more disturbing revelation about humanity's brief but revolutionary impact on galactic warfare. Professor Gray's form shimmered as he accessed the next set of historical records. The display in the lecture hall shifted to show a detailed view of Earth from orbit, captured by the first Coalition scout ships. Before we continue with the war footage, the professor said, you need to understand how completely we misunderstood humans during first contact. Our errors in judgment nearly cost us everything. The image zoomed in to show various human cities, vehicles, and military installations. Our initial survey classified Earth as a standard Class 3 developing world. We noted their primitive nuclear weapons, basic space program, and early digital technology. Based on these observations, our analysts made 3 critical mistakes. Blue raised their crystalline hand. What were the mistakes, Professor? The first mistake, Professor Gray continued, his form expanding to better illustrate his points, was assuming their technology level matched their problem-solving abilities. We saw their simple machines and thought they were simple beings. The display showed humans in various situations, repairing vehicles, performing surgery, building structures, and fighting wars. Look closely, the professor instructed. Humans had already mastered something we didn't understand: the art of working with limited resources. While we focused on their primitive spaceships, we missed how they could repair complex machines with basic tools and raw materials. A student from the gaseous species drifted lower in the chamber, but surely their military capability was accurately assessed. Professor Gray's form flickered with what might have been amusement. That was our second mistake. We analyzed their weapons and defenses using galactic standards. We classified them as harmless because they couldn't damage our ships. The display shifted to show human military history. What we failed to understand was that humans had spent their entire history fighting themselves. They had developed countless ways to wage war with limited technology. When we gave them advanced weapons, they already knew exactly what to do with them. The professor moved to the center of the room, his mercury-like form reflecting the historical images. Our third and most dangerous mistake was in the first contact protocol itself. We followed standard procedures, gradually introducing them to galactic society, carefully controlling their access to advanced technology, limiting their involvement in galactic affairs. He paused, letting the images show a series of meetings between human and alien representatives. But we were desperate. The swarm was winning. We needed soldiers immediately, so we broke our own rules. Instead of the usual century-long integration period, we gave humans access to advanced technology in less than a week. Blue's crystalline hair dimmed with concern. That seems incredibly dangerous. It was. The professor agreed. But what made it truly dangerous wasn't the technology we gave them. It was what they already knew. The display showed human scientists examining alien technology. Their reactions were fascinating. Intense focus, rapid note-taking, and immediate experimentation. You see, Professor Gray explained, humans had something we didn't expect: an enormous library of theoretical science fiction. For centuries, they had been imagining how advanced technology might work. When we showed them real versions of things they had only dreamed about, they didn't need to understand the underlying principles. They already knew what they wanted to do with it. The professor manipulated the display to show human entertainment media, old movies, books, and games about space warfare. While we saw these as primitive fantasies, they were actually centuries of military theoretical research disguised as entertainment. A student with a crystalline structure vibrated with curiosity. They planned for space warfare before they could even reach space. Exactly, the professor said. Humans had imagined countless scenarios of space combat. They had already thought through problems we had never considered. When we gave them real technology, they already had thousands of ideas ready to test. The display showed the first human ships being upgraded with coalition technology. The modifications were shocking, combinations of technologies that no other species had ever considered viable. "Watch this," Professor Gray instructed. He played footage of the first human combat test. A small human vessel faced off against an automated coalition combat drone. The human ship immediately did something unexpected. It used a food preservation beam to freeze the drone's weapon ports. That, the professor pointed, was a standard food storage system designed to keep organic cargo fresh during long voyages. No one had ever considered using it as a weapon. But humans looked at everything as a potential weapon. The students watched in fascination as more test footage played, showing humans repurposing civilian technology in increasingly creative ways. Their integration officer, a being named White, filed this report. Professor Gray said, displaying the text. It reads, "Humans don't see technology as specialized tools. They see it as raw material for solving problems. This makes them either the greatest allies or the most dangerous enemies any species could have." Blue raised their appendage again. "Is that why the integration was stopped?" "No," the professor replied. his form darkening slightly. By the time anyone realized the implications, it was too late. The swarm was approaching Earth's sector. We had no choice but to proceed. The display showed the final preparation phase, human ships joining the coalition fleet. Their vessels looked strange, a mix of primitive human construction and modified alien technology. What you're seeing is perhaps the most dangerous fleet ever assembled, Professor Gray explained, not because of its size or power, but because every ship was commanded by beings who looked at our most basic technology and saw weapons we never imagined. A student near the back spoke up. But Professor, surely there were safeguards, restrictions on what they could modify. Professor Gray's form shifted to what might have been a sad smile. We tried. We gave them strict guidelines about technology modification. But humans have another unique trait. They don't believe in unsolvable problems. When we said something couldn't be done, they saw it as a challenge. The display showed human engineers working on coalition ships, making modifications that made several students emit distress signals. In just 3 days, the professor continued, humans had modified our medical scanners into weapon targeting systems. They turned waste recyclers into missile launchers. They even found a way to use our universal translators to disrupt swarm communication networks. Blue's crystalline structure pulsed with confusion. How could they do this without understanding the basic principles? Because they didn't need to understand how things worked, Professor Gray explained. They only needed to understand what they wanted to achieve. Their motto was, if it works, it works. They called it practical engineering. The professor moved back to his podium, his form settling into its teaching configuration. And that brings us to the moment everything changed. The first actual combat between human-modified ships and the swarm. What you're about to see redefined galactic warfare forever. The lights in the hall dimmed further as the professor prepared to show the next recording. Remember, he said softly, these humans had less than a week to learn about our technology. They had no formal training in galactic warfare. They had never faced an alien enemy before. The display began to show the first battle, and the students leaned forward in anticipation. But they had something more valuable than training or experience, Professor Gray concluded. They had imagination. And as we were about to learn, imagination can be the most powerful weapon of all. The recording began to play, showing the moment when humanity first demonstrated why they would eventually be banned from galactic warfare, not for their savagery or their power, but for their unlimited ability to turn anything into a weapon of war. The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Gray brought up the battle footage. The three-dimensional display showed two fleets facing each other in the darkness of space, the massive red cloud of swarm ships on one side, and the much smaller coalition fleet, now including human vessels, on the other. This, the professor said, his silvery form glowing with intensity, was the first time humans faced the swarm in actual combat. What you're about to see changed everything we thought we knew about warfare. Blue watched intently as the display zoomed in on the human ships. They looked strange, like patchwork creations made from different pieces of technology stuck together. Before we watch this, Professor Gray continued, I want you to notice something about the human ships. See how they appear, messy, unorganized. That wasn't an accident. The humans deliberately made their ships look primitive and poorly constructed. A student from the upper tiers, whose body was made of pure energy, flickered with confusion. Why would they do that? Because, the professor explained, humans understood something we didn't, the power of being underestimated. They called it plain possum, after an Earth creature that pretends to be dead to trick predators. The display began playing the battle footage. The swarm ships moved forward in their usual perfect formation, while the human vessels seemed to drift almost randomly. Watch closely, Professor Gray instructed. This is where it gets interesting. The swarm attacked first, sending out their standard wave of destroyer ships. They ignored the seemingly harmless human vessels and headed straight for the main coalition fleet. This was their first mistake. The swarm's tactical computers, the professor explained, classified the human ships as minimal threats. After all, their sensors showed these vessels were barely holding together. Some appeared to be leaking radiation. Others had obvious structural weaknesses. Blue's crystalline hair sparkled with sudden understanding. It was a trap. Exactly, Professor Gray confirmed. Those radiation leaks. Modified medical scanners, designed to look like engine damage. The structural weaknesses, carefully disguised weapon ports. The humans had turned their ships into what they called Trojan horses, weapons disguised as easy targets. The students watched in amazement as the human ships suddenly sprang into action. Instead of maintaining formation, each vessel seemed to act independently, moving in ways that made no tactical sense, until the results became clear. Look at this ship. The professor pointed to a particularly small human vessel. They named it David, after an ancient story about a small human defeating a giant. Watch what it does. The ship named David appeared to suffer a catastrophic engine failure, drifting directly into the path of a massive swarm carrier. The swarm ignored it, their computers calculating that the damaged vessel posed no threat. Then, just as it was about to collide with the carrier, the human ship transformed. Those apparent damage points. Professor Gray highlighted them in the display. Each one was actually a modified terraforming tool. When activated together, the students watched in shock as the small human ship released a burst of energy that literally pulled the swarm carrier apart at the molecular level. They turned mining equipment into weapons. A student gasped. No, the professor corrected. They turned everything into weapons. That ship used 14 different pieces of civilian technology, none of which were ever designed for combat. The humans called this improvised warfare. The display showed more human ships in action. One vessel used modified food preservation beams to flash freeze swarm ships, making them brittle enough to shatter. Another turned waste recyclers into projectile launchers, firing compressed garbage at near-light speed. But this, Professor Gray said, his form shifting with excitement. This was the moment that truly shocked us. The display focused on a human ship that appeared to be badly damaged, trailing debris behind it. As 3 swarm destroyers moved to finish it off, the debris suddenly came alive. The humans had taken our basic maintenance nanites, the professor explained, and reprogrammed them to act as remote-controlled weapons. That trail of debris was actually millions of tiny robots, each carrying a small amount of explosive material. The students watched as the cloud of nanites swarmed over the swarm ships, finding every tiny crack and weakness in their armor. Within moments, all 3 destroyers exploded from the inside out. This single battle, Professor Gray continued, lasted less than an hour. In that time, 27 human ships destroyed over 200 swarm vessels. More importantly, they demonstrated warfare techniques that had never been seen before in the galaxy. Blue raised their appendage. But Professor, why didn't the swarm adapt? They were known for their ability to evolve new defenses quickly. The professor's form rippled with what might have been amusement. Because, Blue, you can't adapt to an enemy that never uses the same trick twice. Every human ship had different modifications, different weapons, different tactics. The swarm's strength was their ability to analyze patterns and develop countermeasures. But humans didn't follow patterns. The display showed more of the battle, with each human ship using different combinations of modified technology. One vessel turned its artificial gravity generators into weapons, creating localized gravity wells that crushed swarm ships. Another used communication arrays to broadcast signals that confused the swarm's hive-mind coordination. By the end of this first engagement, Professor Gray said, the swarm had lost more ships than in the previous month of fighting. But more importantly, they had encountered something they couldn't understand, an enemy that turned their own predictability against them. The professor moved to the center of the room, his mercury-like form reflecting the battle images. The humans had a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. When faced with an overwhelming enemy, They didn't try to match the swarm's strength. Instead, they found ways to turn everything, absolutely everything, into an advantage. The display showed the battle's aftermath. The swarm fleet was retreating, leaving behind a field of destroyed ships. The human vessels, despite their apparently damaged appearance, were mostly intact. This victory, Professor Gray concluded, should have been impossible. The humans were outnumbered 10-1. They were using unfamiliar technology. They had never fought in space before. But they had something more valuable than experience or numbers. They had creativity. The professor's form returned to his podium. And that, students, was just the first hour of the first day. What happened next? He paused, his form shifting to a darker shade. What happened next made this battle look like a simple practice exercise. The lights in the hall began to dim again as Professor Gray prepared to show the next phase of the war. Because now the swarm had made a fatal mistake. They had made humans angry. And an angry human, as the galaxy was about to learn, is the most dangerous force in the universe. Professor Gray's form rippled as he adjusted the lecture hall's display. Instead of showing battle footage, the screen now displayed detailed scans of human brain activity during combat. What you're about to learn, the professor began, his silvery form pulsing gently, is perhaps the most important reason humans are banned from galactic warfare. It's not their technology. It's not their tactics. It's how their minds work under pressure. Blue raised their crystalline appendage. But Professor, surely all species feel stress in combat. Ah, Professor Gray's form brightened. That's what we thought too. But humans don't just feel stress. They thrive on it. Watch this. The display showed side-by-side comparisons of different species' brain activities during battle situations. The alien brain showed normal patterns of stress response, increased activity in survival centers, decreased activity in creative thinking areas. This is how most species react to combat, the professor explained. When faced with danger, their brains focus on survival. They fall back on training. They'd follow established protocols. Then he showed the human brain scans. The students emitted various sounds of surprise. The human brain showed completely different patterns. Notice something strange? Professor Gray asked. Under extreme stress, human cognitive function doesn't decrease, it increases. Their creative thinking centers actually become more active, not less. A student made of pure energy flickered with confusion. That's impossible. Stress hormones should inhibit complex thinking. Should, yes, the professor agreed. But humans evolved differently. They developed something they call stress response enhancement, the ability to think more clearly and creatively when under pressure. The display shifted to show footage from human ship bridges during combat. The crews weren't panicking. They weren't even following standard protocols. They were innovating. Look at this example. Professor Gray highlighted one scene. This human cruise ship lost its main weapons in the middle of a battle. Standard protocol would be to retreat. Instead, they started brainstorming. The students watched as the human crew rapidly discussed options, tried new ideas, and eventually turned their ship's broken weapon system into an improvised electromagnetic pulse generator. They called this thinking on their feet, the professor explained. The more desperate the situation, the more creative their solutions became. It was like the threat of death actually improved their problem-solving abilities. Blue's crystalline hair pulsed with interest. Is that why they modified equipment during battles? Exactly, Professor Gray confirmed. Most species would never consider modifying technology during combat. The risk of failure is too high, but humans, they saw combat as the perfect time to experiment. The display showed multiple examples of humans making rapid modifications to their equipment during battles. They rewired systems, rebuilt components, and created new weapons while under direct fire. They had another saying. The professor continued, "Necessity is the mother of invention." For humans, the most dangerous situation was actually when they had time to think carefully. Given time, They might question their ideas or consider the risks. But in combat, with death approaching, they just did things. A student near the back raised an appendage. But surely this led to many failures. Oh yes, Professor Gray's form shimmered with what might have been amusement. Humans failed constantly. But here's the fascinating part. They saw failure as valuable data. Each failed attempt taught them something new, and they shared this information instantly across their fleet. The display showed the human communication networks during battle. Unlike the organized, protocol-based communications of other species, human ships were constantly sharing ideas, modifications, and even jokes. They called it crowdsourcing. The professor explained, if one ship discovered a new way to use technology, every human captain immediately knew about it. They treated warfare like a group project, with everyone contributing ideas. The professor moved to the center of the room, his form expanding to better illustrate his points. But the most remarkable aspect of human psychology in warfare was something they called spite. The display showed a human ship, heavily damaged and clearly unable to win its battle. Instead of surrendering or retreating, the crew started laughing. This, Professor Gray said, confused our psychologists more than anything else. The humans weren't afraid of losing. They weren't even afraid of dying. They were determined that if they were going to lose, they would cause as much damage as possible in the process. Blue's crystalline structure vibrated with confusion. That seems irrational. Completely irrational, the professor agreed. And that's what made it so effective. The swarm, like most species, based their strategies on rational behavior. They couldn't predict or counter an enemy that would gladly destroy themselves just to cause damage. The display showed more examples of human spite in action. Ships using their own destruction as weapons. Crews manually detonating damaged systems to create impromptu bombs. Pilots flying directly into enemy formations just to test new weapon ideas. But here's the truly fascinating part, Professor Gray continued. This apparently suicidal behavior was actually carefully calculated. Humans had developed something they called controlled recklessness, the ability to take enormous risks while maintaining just enough control to survive. A student made of liquid shifted form nervously. How could they maintain control while being reckless? Because, the professor explained, humans don't see these concepts as opposites. They can be methodically careful about being completely reckless. They plan their chaos. They organize their disorder. It's a paradox that other species find almost impossible to understand. The display showed the casualty rates from the first day of human combat. Despite their apparently suicidal tactics, human survival rates were surprisingly high. Look at these numbers. Professor Gray highlighted the statistics. Humans had a 70% survival rate while using tactics that our military experts classified as certain death. They weren't just being reckless, they were being precisely reckless. The professor's form returned to the podium, shifting to a more serious configuration. And this, students, is why humans are so dangerous in warfare. Not because they're stronger, or faster, or more technologically advanced, but because their minds work in ways that make them impossible to predict. He brought up one final display, showing a famous quote from a swarm tactical analysis. The humans appear to be operating on a form of logic that we cannot comprehend. They treat certain death as a minor inconvenience, impossible tasks as interesting challenges, and total warfare as a form of entertainment. We cannot defeat an enemy whose victory condition is simply causing chaos. The lights in the hall began to brighten slightly as Professor Gray prepared to move to the next topic. Remember this lesson well, students. The most dangerous weapon in warfare isn't the biggest gun or the strongest shield. It's a mind that can turn disadvantages into advantages, that thinks most clearly when death is approaching, and that sees the impossible as simply another interesting problem to solve. The professor's form solidified as he prepared to show the next set of records. And now, let me show you what happened when the humans discovered that the swarm was targeting civilian colonies. Because if you thought they were dangerous when fighting for victory, His form darkened slightly. Wait until you see what they did when fighting for revenge. Professor Gray's form darkened noticeably as he prepared the next set of historical records. The lecture hall's lighting shifted to a deep red, matching the somber mood of the upcoming content. What you're about to see, the professor began, his voice quieter than before, marks the moment when the Seven-Day War changed from a military conflict into something else entirely. This was when humans discovered what the swarm was doing to civilian colonies. Blue's crystalline hair dimmed with concern. What happened, Professor? The display showed a human scout ship receiving a distress signal from a small mining colony on the edge of Coalition space. The timestamp showed this was during the third day of human involvement in the war. The humans had been fighting effectively, Professor Gray explained, but they were still treating it like a standard military engagement. They followed most of our protocols, despite their unusual methods. Then this happened. The recording played. The human scout ship arrived at the colony, expecting to find it under attack. Instead, they found something worse, the aftermath of a swarm feeding. Until this point, the professor continued, his form rippling with remembered distress, we had protected humans from seeing the worst of what the swarm did to civilian populations. We thought we were being kind. We were wrong. The display showed the human crew's reaction as they investigated the colony. Their vital signs, displayed alongside the footage, showed something unexpected. Notice their biological responses, Professor Gray pointed out. Their stress hormones are spiking, yes, but look at their brain patterns. This isn't fear or horror you're seeing. This is rage. A student from the gaseous species drifted lower, but surely they knew the swarm consumed organic matter. It was in the briefing materials. Knowing something intellectually, the professor replied, is very different from seeing it firsthand. Humans have a peculiar quality. They can understand terrible things in theory, but seeing them in reality triggers something they call righteous fury. The display shifted to show the human ship's commander making their report to the Coalition fleet. The universal translators barely kept up with the intensity of their speech. This transmission, Professor Gray said, changed everything. The human commander didn't just report what they'd found. They'd made a promise, one that our translators struggled to convey properly because it contained concepts we didn't have words for. The professor played the transmission. They're not just killing soldiers. They're hunting civilians, children. This isn't war anymore. This is extermination. And if that's how they want to play it, we'll show them what humanity does to monsters. Blue's crystalline structure vibrated with tension. What did they mean? Until this point, Professor Gray explained, humans had been fighting according to their understanding of military conduct. They had rules, limits, lines they wouldn't cross. But the swarm had just crossed what humans call the moral event horizon. They had attacked civilians deliberately. The display showed the rapid change in human battle tactics following this discovery. Their ships stopped maintaining formation. Their communications became shorter, more intense. Watch what happens to their ships, the professor instructed. The students observed as human vessels began removing safety systems, overclocking weapons, and making modifications that their own crews called questionably sane. They started taking risks that even they considered extreme, Professor Gray continued. But more importantly, they stopped trying to win battles. Now they wanted to eliminate the swarm completely. The display showed a human ship deliberately flying into a swarm formation. Instead of attacking, it released all its modified medical nanites into the swarm ship's ventilation systems. These nanites, the professor explained, were originally designed to heal injuries. The humans reprogrammed them to identify and attack swarm neural tissue. It wasn't enough for them to destroy swarm ships anymore. They wanted to make sure nothing survived. A student near the back raised an appendage, but that's biological warfare. It violates Coalition protocols. Yes, Professor Gray agreed, his form shifting uncomfortably. But humans have a saying. All bets are off. When they discovered the swarm was targeting civilians, they decided that normal rules of warfare no longer applied. The display showed more examples of this new phase of human combat. They turned terraforming equipment into weapons that could render entire regions of space uninhabitable to swarm biology. They modified communication arrays to broadcast signals that caused physical pain to swarm neural networks. But this, the professor said, highlighting one particular incident, was when we truly understood what we had unleashed. The footage showed a human ship that had been critically damaged by swarm attacks. Instead of retreating or surrendering, the crew activated what they called Protocol Zero. They converted their entire ship into a weapon. Professor Gray explained. They used their medical systems to saturate their own atmosphere with a chemical that would react explosively with swarm biomatter. Then they deliberately allowed their ship to be consumed by a swarm carrier. The students watched in shocked silence as the resulting chain reaction destroyed not just the carrier, but every swarm ship that had been contaminated by the scattered debris. The humans called this turning the enemy's strength into a weakness. The professor continued. The swarm's habit of consuming their victims became the perfect delivery system for human weapons. Blue's crystalline hair pulsed with a new understanding. They weren't just fighting anymore, were they? They were exterminating. Exactly. Professor Gray confirmed. Humans have a concept they call total war, the idea that when fighting for survival, especially protecting civilians, no method is too extreme. The professor moved to the center of the room, his form expanding to emphasize his next points. What you're seeing is why humans are truly banned from warfare. Not because they're powerful or cruel, but because they refuse to lose when protecting others. They will break any rule, violate any protocol, and sacrifice themselves without hesitation if it means saving civilian lives. The display showed the aftermath of this change in human tactics. Swarm ships began retreating from any area where human vessels were detected. The hunters had become the hunted. The swarm made a fatal mistake. Professor Gray concluded. They assumed that attacking civilian targets would demoralize their enemy. Instead, they gave humans something they are terrifyingly good at, a moral justification for unlimited warfare. The professor's form returned to the podium, dimming slightly. And this, students, was still only the beginning. Because now the humans weren't just fighting to win. They were fighting to ensure the swarm could never threaten another civilian population again. The lights in the hall began to shift again as Professor Gray prepared to show the next phase of the war. What you're about to see next is why the galactic community ultimately decided that humans needed to be protected from being used as weapons. Because when humans fight for revenge, they don't stop at victory. They make sure their enemy cannot ever rise again. Professor Gray's form shifted to a bright silver as he changed the lecture hall's display. The screen now showed detailed technical diagrams of various coalition technologies, alongside their human modifications. What you're about to learn, the professor began, is how humans transformed our peaceful technology into what they called the planet cracker. But first, you need to understand how they thought about technology itself. Blue raised their crystalline appendage. Wasn't the planet cracker just a weapon, Professor? No. Professor Gray's form rippled with intensity. It was much more than that. It was proof that humans don't see technology the way we do. They don't see limitations. They see possibilities. The display showed a standard coalition terraforming device, a massive machine designed to gradually reshape planets for colonization. This, the professor indicated, was designed to make uninhabitable worlds suitable for life. It took decades to transform a single planet. The humans looked at it for exactly 12 minutes before asking a question that horrified our engineers. A student made of pure energy flickered with curiosity. What did they ask? They asked. Professor Gray's form dimmed slightly. If it can put a planet together, can it take one apart? That single question changed everything. The display split to show the original terraforming device alongside human modifications. The changes looked simple but were profound. Look closely, the professor instructed. They didn't fundamentally change how the device worked. They just reversed its operating principles. Instead of carefully restructuring matter over time, they made it work in reverse and do it all at once. The students watched as technical diagrams showed the modification process. The humans had taken the patient, careful terraforming technology and turned it into something that could tear a planet's crust apart in minutes. But this wasn't even the most disturbing part, Professor Gray continued. The planet cracker was just the beginning. Once humans understood they could reverse engineer our peaceful technology, they started looking at everything differently. The display showed more examples. Medical nanites reprogrammed to disassemble swarm ships from the inside. Atmospheric processors modified to create localized singularities. Food synthesizers turned into molecular disruptors. They called this lateral thinking, the professor explained. Instead of trying to invent new weapons, they looked at existing technology and asked, how can this be used differently? Blue's crystalline hair pulsed with concern. But surely there were safeguards. Limitations. Oh yes, Professor Gray confirmed. Every piece of coalition technology had multiple safeguards. But humans have a saying, where there's a will, there's a way. They didn't try to break the safeguards. They found ways to work around them. The display showed human engineers working on coalition equipment. Instead of trying to disable safety systems, they were adding new components that changed how the original technology functioned. Watch this example. The professor highlighted one scene. These humans are modifying a standard waste recycling unit. Instead of trying to override its safety protocols, they added what they called a feedback loop. The machine still thought it was recycling waste. It just happened to be doing it at speeds that turned the recycled material into plasma. A student near the back spoke up, but that's impossible. The systems are designed to prevent such modifications. Exactly. Professor Gray's form brightened. They're designed to prevent modifications we could think of. But humans don't think like us. They don't try to change the rules. They find new ways to use them. The display showed more examples of human innovation. They connected different systems in ways that had never been intended. They created feedback loops that amplified normal functions to dangerous levels. They combined technologies that were never meant to work together. Here's what truly frightened our engineers, the professor continued. The humans weren't breaking anything. Every system was working exactly as designed. They just used them in ways we had never imagined possible. The screen showed the construction of the first planet cracker. It looked deceptively simple, just a collection of standard terraforming equipment arranged in a new configuration. Notice how basic it looks, Professor Gray pointed out. No advanced weapons, no complex new technology. Just ordinary terraforming equipment connected in ways that turned its world-building capabilities into world-breaking power. Blue raised their appendage again. How did they develop this so quickly? Because, the professor explained, humans have been thinking about how to weaponize technology since before they had technology. They had thousands of years of stories, films, and games about turning peaceful tools into weapons. When they saw our technology, they already had countless ideas ready to test. The display shifted to show the first test of the planet cracker. The students watched in silence as a small, uninhabited planet was literally torn apart from the inside. The worst part, Professor Gray continued, was that this worked exactly as designed. It didn't destroy the planet. It deconstructed it in a controlled, systematic way. The humans had turned planet-building technology into a precision planet-destroying tool. A student made of liquid rippled with distress. But why? Why make something so terrible? Because, the professor's form darkened. Humans believed that the threat of such a weapon would force the swarm to retreat. They called it deterrence through unacceptable consequences. They built it hoping they would never have to use it. The display showed more human innovations, each one more creative and disturbing than the last. They turned shield generators into weapons that could implode swarm ships. They modified faster-than-light drives to create temporal distortion fields. But the planet cracker, Professor Gray said, was just the most visible example. Every human ship became a laboratory for what they called creative problem-solving. They shared ideas across their fleet, each innovation building on the last. The professor moved to the center of the room, his form expanding. This is why humans are banned from warfare. Not because they're destructive. Many species are destructive. Not because they're clever. Many species are clever. They're banned because they can look at anything, absolutely anything, and see how it could be used as a weapon. The display showed the final tally of human innovations during the 7-Day War. Over 3,000 new weapons created, all from modified civilian technology. And remember, Professor Gray concluded, they did all this in less than a week, with technology they barely understood, working with systems they had never seen before. Imagine what they could do with time to really study and understand our technology. The professor's form returned to the podium, shifting to a serious configuration. The ban on humans in warfare isn't about protecting the galaxy from them. It's about protecting them, and our technology, from being used as weapons ever again. The lights in the hall began to shift again as Professor Gray prepared to show the next phase of the war. And now let me show you what happened when the humans decided to use all these innovations at once. Because if you thought the planet Cracker was frightening, his form flickered. Wait until you see what they called Operation Endgame. Professor Gray's form turned a deep, almost metallic blue as he prepared to show the final battle footage. The lecture hall's lighting dimmed to near darkness, with only the display providing illumination. What you're about to witness, the professor began solemnly, is what humans called Operation Endgame. 7 hours that changed galactic warfare forever. This is why the ban on human warfare isn't just a law. It's a survival necessity. Blue's crystalline hair dimmed with anticipation. Was this when they used the planet Cracker? The planet Cracker? Professor Gray's form shimmered. That was just one part of their plan. What they did was far more comprehensive. The display showed the human fleet gathering. Their ships no longer looked cobbled together or damaged. Now they appeared sleek, purposeful, and completely unlike anything in the Coalition's records. By this point, the professor explained, humans had spent 6 days modifying every piece of technology we gave them, but they hadn't deployed most of their innovations yet. They were waiting. A student made of pure energy flickered curiously. Waiting for what? They called it critical mass, Professor Gray replied. They wanted the swarm to commit their full force, so they pretended to be weaker than they were, falling back, appearing disorganized. The swarm took the bait. The display showed the massive swarm fleet, nearly 1 million ships, converging on what they thought was a retreating enemy. The humans had a saying. The professor continued, "Go big or go home." When they launched Operation Endgame, they didn't just want to win. They wanted to ensure the swarm could never threaten another civilization again. The display split into multiple views, showing different aspects of the human battle plan. Each ship carried different modifications, different weapons, different tactics. First, Professor Gray indicated they deployed what they called Operation Blackout. The students watched as human ships released clouds of modified nanites into space. These weren't weapons. They were communication disruptors. The swarm relied on their hive mind for coordination, the professor explained. Humans didn't try to destroy it. They just created so much noise that the swarm couldn't think clearly. Imagine 1 million voices all shouting different things at once. The display showed the effect. Swarm ships beginning to move erratically, their perfect formation breaking down. Then, Professor Gray continued, came Operation Scissor. The human fleet split into smaller groups, each targeting specific parts of the confused swarm fleet. But instead of attacking directly, they deployed their modified terraforming equipment. Watch closely, the professor instructed. Each human squadron is using different technology. Some created localized gravity wells. Others generated temporal distortion fields. Some simply transformed nearby space into states where swarm biology couldn't function. Blue raised their appendage. They were dividing the swarm. Exactly, Professor Gray confirmed. They called it divide and conquer. By splitting the swarm into smaller groups, they could test all their weapons at once. Each squadron used different tactics, different modifications. The swarm couldn't adapt because there were too many different attacks happening simultaneously. The display showed the battle's progression. Human ships moved with precise coordination, herding swarm vessels into prepared killing zones. Hour 3, the professor continued, was when they revealed the true purpose of the planet Cracker. The students watched as the massive device activated, but instead of targeting planets, it created a web of gravitational distortions throughout the battlefield. The planet Cracker wasn't just a weapon, Professor Gray explained. It was part of a larger trap. The humans used it to create corridors in space, areas where swarm ships had to go if they wanted to escape. And in these corridors, the display showed what waited in the corridors: human ships with every kind of modified technology they had developed. They called these kill boxes, the professor said. When swarm ships entered these zones, they faced every weapon humans had invented. Modified medical nanites that ate through their hulls, terraforming beams that altered the physical laws within small areas of space, communication arrays that overloaded their neural networks. A student near the back raised an appendage. But surely some swarm ships escaped. That was part of the plan. Professor Gray's form darkened. The humans deliberately left escape routes, but these routes led to areas where they had already deployed their most insidious weapon: modified atmospheric processors. The display showed swarm ships escaping through these corridors, only to encounter clouds of seemingly empty space. These processors, the professor explained, didn't just affect ship atmospheres. They changed the quantum structure of space itself. Any swarm ship that passed through these zones carried the changes back to their fleet. It was like a virus, but it spread through space itself. The students watched in silence as the effect spread through the swarm fleet. Ships began to break down at the molecular level, their very structure becoming unstable. By hour 5, Professor Gray continued, the swarm realized they were trapped. They tried to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The humans had turned space itself into a weapon. The display showed the final phase of the battle. The remaining swarm ships, desperate to escape, clustered together, exactly as the humans had planned. The last 2 hours, the professor said, were not combat. They were execution. The humans activated everything at once: every weapon, every modification, every piece of twisted technology they had created. The swarm didn't just die. They were erased. Blue's crystalline hair pulsed with horror. How many survived? Out of nearly 1 million swarm ships, Professor Gray replied solemnly, 17 escaped. And those 17 carried the seeds of their own destruction back to their homeworlds. Within a month, the entire swarm civilization had collapsed. The professor moved to the center of the room, his form expanding to emphasize his next points. This is why humans are banned from warfare. Not because they're cruel. They aren't. Not because they're evil. They're not. They're banned because when they go to war, they don't just fight. They solve the problem permanently. The display showed the aftermath of the battle, a graveyard of swarm ships stretching across an entire sector of space. 7 hours, Professor Gray concluded. In 7 hours, humans didn't just win a battle. They ended a war that had raged for decades. They didn't just defeat an enemy. They made sure that enemy could never threaten anyone again. The professor's form returned to the podium, shifting to a solemn configuration. And now you understand why the ban exists. Because humans don't just win wars, they end them. Permanently. Completely. And they do it by turning everything, absolutely everything, into a weapon. The lights in the hall began to brighten as Professor Gray prepared for the final part of the lecture. But what happened next? What the humans did after their victory? That's the real reason they're protected by galactic law. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing about humans isn't how they fight. It's how they make peace. Professor Gray's form shifted to a gentle silver as he prepared to show the final records. The lecture hall's lighting returned to normal, signaling the transition from war to peace. Now, the professor began, we come to the most important part of this history, not the destruction humans caused, but what they did afterward. This is why they're classified as a protected species rather than a prohibited threat. Blue raised their crystalline appendage one last time. What did they do, Professor? They went home, Professor Gray said simply. After destroying one of the most powerful forces in the galaxy, after proving they could turn any technology into a weapon, after showing they could end civilizations, they just went home. The display showed the human fleet gathering after their victory. Instead of celebrating, they were already dismantling their weapons. This, the professor indicated, confused the Coalition Council more than anything else. The humans had just won the greatest military victory in galactic history. They had technology that could reshape planets, control space itself. By all normal logic, they should have used this power to establish themselves as a dominant force. A student made of pure energy flickered with curiosity. Why didn't they? Because Professor Gray's form brightened. Humans had something the Council had never seen before. They called it genre awareness. The display showed the Emergency Council meeting that followed the war. Representatives from every major civilization gathered to decide how to handle the human situation. The human representatives, the professor continued, came to this meeting with something unexpected, a list of restrictions on their own species. The display showed the human proposals. They wanted limitations on what technology they could access. They requested monitoring of their military development. They even suggested the ban that would eventually be implemented. You see, Professor Gray explained, humans had spent centuries telling themselves stories about power corrupting, about the dangers of advanced technology, about the responsibilities that come with great capabilities. They had warned themselves about these dangers before they even had the power to cause them. Blue's crystalline hair pulsed with confusion. They wanted to be restricted. More than that, the professor replied. They demanded it. They showed the Council their entertainment media. Thousands of stories about civilizations that gained too much power too quickly and destroyed themselves. They had been preparing for this moment before they even knew it would come. The display showed clips from human media, stories about technology gone wrong, about the dangers of unlimited power, about the importance of restraint. But here's what truly amazed the Council, Professor Gray continued. The humans didn't just want restrictions. They wanted a new role in the galaxy. They offered to become peacekeepers, mediators, problem solvers. The professor moved to the center of the room, his form expanding. They argued that their creativity, their ability to think differently, could be used to prevent wars rather than win them. They said that understanding how to turn anything into a weapon made them perfect for figuring out how to turn weapons back into tools. The display showed the new human role developing. Their ships, once modified for war, were now used for rescue missions. Their innovative thinking helped solve diplomatic crises. Their understanding of how things could go wrong helped prevent disasters. The Council expected resistance, Professor Gray said. They thought humans would fight against restrictions on their capabilities. Instead, humans helped design those restrictions. They even added clauses we hadn't considered. A student near the back spoke up. What kind of clauses? Fascinating ones, the professor replied. They insisted on regular cultural exchange programs, so they wouldn't become isolated. They requested that their entertainment media be shared with other species, so their warnings about power and responsibility would spread. They even demanded that their own history of warfare be taught in places like this academy. The display showed the final version of the ban, not just restrictions on human warfare, but a comprehensive plan for human integration into galactic society. And so, Professor Gray continued, humans became the first species to be banned from warfare for their own protection, and for ours, not because they were too dangerous, but because they understood exactly how dangerous they could become. The professor's form shifted to show various images of humans in their new roles, mediating disputes, solving technical problems, helping with disaster relief. Today, he said, humans are among our most valuable allies. Their creativity, once used to create weapons, now helps us build better worlds. Their ability to think differently helps us solve problems we never could have handled alone. And their warnings about power and responsibility have become part of our own teaching. Blue raised their appendage one final time. Professor, do you think the humans will ever fight again? Professor Gray's form softened. They still fight, but now they'd fight against problems, not people. They battle natural disasters, technical challenges, diplomatic crises. And when they absolutely must engage in combat, they do so with carefully limited technology and strict oversight. The display showed one final image, a human ship responding to a distress call, using the same innovative thinking that had once won a war to now save lives. Remember this lesson well, students, the professor concluded. The humans aren't banned from warfare because we fear their capacity for destruction. They're banned because they taught us something invaluable, that the most powerful weapon isn't technology or strength or even creativity. It's the wisdom to know when not to use your power at all. The lights in the hall returned to full brightness as Professor Gray prepared to end the lecture. And that, students, is why every diplomatic vessel in the galaxy now carries at least one human crew member. Because sometimes, the best way to win a war is to figure out how to solve problems without fighting at all. The professor's form returned to its standard teaching configuration. For your next assignment, I want you to study human entertainment media, particularly their stories about power and responsibility, because the humans didn't just learn from their mistakes. They imagined them before they could happen and taught themselves to avoid them. As the students began to gather their things, Professor Gray added one final thought. And remember, if you ever meet a human, don't fear them. Thank them. Because their greatest victory wasn't defeating the swarm. It was choosing not to become the next terrible force in the galaxy. Instead, they chose to become something far more valuable. Teachers, helpers, and guardians of peace. The class ended, but the lesson would stay with the students forever. They had learned the real reason humans were banned from warfare, not because of what they could do to others, but because of what they chose to do instead.